Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In the early spring of 1483, when the air in Lisbon was still cool with Atlantic mist, a carrack named Snow Bartolomeo rocked gently in the waters of the Tagus River. Her hull was a deep brown, swollen from years of ocean voyages. She was not a new ship, but she had been fitted with new rigging, stronger canvas, and reinforced timbers for the journey ahead. She was bound for the southern coast of Africa, or at least that was what the port records claimed. In reality, the full nature of her cargo and mission was known to only a handful of men within the Portuguese crown's service. This was the age of discoveries, a time when Portugal was reaching further along the African coastline with each voyage. Their ships brought back not only pepper and gold, but also stories that hinted of lands even further away. It's places that could change the balance of trade forever. The Snow Bartolomeo's departure came at a time when the map of the world, as Europeans understood it, was in motion. The Mediterranean powers, Venice, Genoa, still controlled much of the eastern trade through intermediaries in the Islamic world. But Portugal had been building its own chain of knowledge, from Ceuta to Madeira, down past the Canary Islands, Cape Bajador, and now beyond the Gulf of Guinea. Each voyage extended the Portuguese presence just a little further south. The Snow Bartolomeo was meant to continue that push. But she was different. The royal warehousemen worked in silence, supervised closely by guards in the service of King Joe II. The records that survive are sparse, but one document in the royal archive, written in a clerk's careful hand, lists items loaded into her hold: barrels of iron nails and tools, standard for building or trade, bales of woven cloth, some coarse for barter, some fine for gifts to coastal rulers, large clay amphorae, sealed with pitch, their contents not specified, 2 heavy chests marked only with the symbol of the royal armillary sphere, a small set of crates labeled Delicato, fragile. The secrecy surrounding those last 3 entries was unusual at the time. Portugal's overseas ventures were tightly guarded state projects. Information could mean fortune or ruin. The Spanish kingdoms were watching closely. So were the Italian merchants who feared losing their hold on the spice trade. Even whispers of a new trade route could draw unwanted competition. The captain of the Snow Bartolomeo, Diego Ferreira, was a man in his late 40s, hardened by years on the Guinea coast. He was not known for charm, but for discipline. His crew respected his ability to navigate both the sea and the complex politics of overseas trade. He was trusted with difficult assignments where secrecy was as important as CMANSHIP. On the day of departure, the docks were crowded with merchants, laborers, and onlookers. Yet the boarding of the Snow Bartolomeo's final cargo took place at dawn, before most had arrived. Witnesses later recalled seeing barrels lifted by block and tackle, lowered into the hold, and then the hatches sealed. The ship's pilot charted their course, first south along the familiar coast, then beyond the equator, toward the area around the Congo River, and possibly further. But what few realized was that the ship also carried orders to make contact with vessels returning from further east. Arab and Swahili traders who linked Africa's eastern coast to the Indian Ocean network. If the rumors were true, there might be pepper, ivory, and even silks aboard those ships. For Portugal, any small cargo acquired in this way before direct voyages to India were possible would be proof that the Indian Ocean trade could be tapped without crossing the Mediterranean. The Snow Bartolomeo set sail on a clear morning tide. Her sails filled, and she drifted slowly down the Tagus toward the open sea. Fishermen paused in their work to watch her pass, knowing she might be gone for many months. Life aboard a carrack was slow and repetitive in fair weather. The cruise days were filled with trimming sails, mending ropes, and checking for leaks. Water had to be rationed carefully. Salted meat, hardtack, and dried beans made up most of the meals. Rats were common, as were arguments about rations and duties. The cargo hold, sealed and locked, was visited only by the captain and his trusted quartermaster. Even the ship's clerk, who recorded the loading of goods, was not permitted to open the chests. By late May, the ship had reached the Gulf of Guinea. They stopped at Elmina, the Portuguese fortress recently built on the coast, to take on fresh water and trade for gold dust. Here, some suggest, part of the Snow Bartolomew's cargo was exchanged or added to in a transaction kept off the official books. A few accounts from African traders recorded decades later describe a Portuguese ship in that season, carrying boxes of fine metal and a great jar of black stones. Whether this referred to the Snow Bartolomeu is uncertain, but the timing and description match. From Elmina, the ship turned south, heading into waters less frequented by European vessels. The coastlines here were poorly mapped. Storms could drive a ship aground on uncharted reefs, yet the Snow Bartolomew's voyage seemed to go smoothly. It is the return journey, not the outward one, that became the mystery. After months in the south, it was sighted by fishermen off Snowtome, heading north again. She was low in the water, a sign of heavy cargo, and her sails were patched in places, suggesting rough weather had been met. Then she vanished. No wreck was found on the coast. No survivors reached Lisbon. The ship's name was eventually crossed from the royal lists with a note lost at sea. But rumors began to circulate. One said she had been caught in a storm and driven far west into waters no Portuguese ship had yet claimed. Another said she had been attacked by foreign vessels, perhaps Castilian, perhaps pirates from further afield, who took her cargo before scuttling her. And one persistent rumor, the one that gave rise to centuries of quiet speculation, claimed that her 2 royal-marked chests had contained objects never meant for public knowledge, objects that, had they arrived in Lisbon, I'd have changed Portugal's ambitions in the Atlantic entirely. What those objects were is a matter of guesswork. Some suggested maps, not of Africa, but of lands further across the ocean. Others whispered of mineral samples, gold, in a form not mined in Africa, hinting at another source. The truth, like the Snow Bartolomeu herself, was gone beneath the waves. Yet her disappearance came at a pivotal moment. Within a decade, Columbus would cross the Atlantic under the Spanish flag. Portugal would reach India by sea. The race for trade routes would explode into a global contest. But somewhere, in an unknown stretch of ocean, a ship carrying the quiet beginnings of that future had gone down, and with her, perhaps, a secret sealed in chests, locked in darkness that no one would open again. The last confirmed sighting was a passing reference in a merchant's letter. We saw the Bartolomeu under full sail, bound for home, but heavy in the water. She did not alter course. Days later, storms swept the Gulf of Guinea. If she sank, her cargo might still lie there beneath silt and coral. If she was taken, the trail was erased. Well, the question remains, not just what happened to her, but what was it that she carried home, guarded so carefully, that vanished with her into the Atlantic silence. When the Snow Bartolomeu failed to appear in Lisbon by late autumn of 1483, the royal court reacted with caution. Ships were often delayed. Wines could trap a carrack in the doldrums for weeks. Illness among the crew could force an unplanned stop. And the sea, always unpredictable, could scatter a fleet across hundreds of miles. But by December, when the North Atlantic storms began to rage, and still there was no word, the Crown quietly acknowledged the growing likelihood that the ship was lost. The loss of any vessel was serious, but this one carried unusual weight. King Joel II had personally approved her mission, and her manifest, even in its censored form, listed items tied to strategic goals. Losing her meant more than losing a few tons of pepper or ivory. It meant losing proof, perhaps even physical evidence of opportunities beyond Portugal's established reach. The first sign that the search would be different came from the king's decision to dispatch the caravels, small and swift, to sail south along the African coast. Their official orders were to deliver supplies to outposts, but their captains were given sealed letters with instructions to be opened only once they were clear of the Tagus. We know from later testimony that those letters described the snow, Bartolomew's last known course, and instructed the captains to look for any sign of wreckage. Survivors, cargo. The problem was that the Gulf of Guinea, where she had last been sighted, was vast. Winds and currents could carry debris far from a sinking point, and if she had been taken by force, there might be no debris at all. The caravels reached Almina in January of 1484. There, it's questioned local traders and Portuguese factors about any strange sightings. One report mentioned a heavy ship passing north weeks earlier, patched and riding low in the water. Another claimed that a sudden storm had struck soon after, with lightning that split the night like the sky was being torn apart. The searchers pushed further south, skirting the coast. At Snowtone, the Portuguese governor admitted hearing rumors from fishermen about a ship in trouble, her mainsail torn, listing slightly, but no one had seen her sink. At one river mouth, the crew found a plank bearing a faint armillary sphere, carving the mark of the royal cargo. It was water-worn, and the iron nails had rusted 2 orange streaks. Whether it came from the snow, Bartolomeu, or another royal ship was impossible to say. By March, the caravels had to turn back. Supplies were low, and the crew had been battered by storms. They returned to Lisbon with no definitive answers, only fragments of rumor and a few scraps of wood for the crown. The matter could have ended there. Another ship marked as lost, another note in the archives. But for reasons not fully recorded, the king authorized a second phase of the search, this time far less public. This effort was led not by naval officers, but by Diogo de Alencar, a pilot with experience in uncharted waters. He was given a small crew and a fast caravel, and his instructions were verbal, not written. The absence of records makes historians suspect that the mission was as much about recovering specific items as it was about finding survivors. Diogo's voyage left Lisbon in early summer 1484 and did not return for nearly a year. The few surviving accounts suggest he traveled far beyond the Gulf of Guinea, perhaps west into the open Atlantic. One Portuguese chronicler, writing decades later, claimed Diogo had been following a shadow of a trail left by a vessel matching the Bartolomew's description, seen by Canary Island fishermen far from normal routes. If this was true, then the ship, or whatever remained of her, might have been driven into waters that no Portuguese expedition had yet charted in Lisbon. Meanwhile, interest in the snow Bartolomew's fate was quietly fading in public view. The court was focused on negotiations with Spain over exploration rights talks that would eventually lead to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Yet, within certain circles, merchants tied to the royal household, navigators who had heard the whispers, the story of the lost Carac took on a life of its own. One rumor said her chests had contained artifacts from far eastern Africa, obtained through clandestine trade with Arab merchants, including carved ivory tusks and manuscripts in unfamiliar scripts. If these had reached Lisbon, Tay might have proven the feasibility of bypassing the overland spice routes entirely. Another rumor, more improbable but persistent, claimed she had taken on board something even rarer, a mineral sample of bright yellow ore, unlike any gold found in Africa, and wrapped in layers of cloth. Some speculated it was from a land far to the west, known only to a few coastal traders. Of course, such speculation was impossible to prove. But the secrecy surrounding her final mission meant that almost any theory could find believers. By the time Diogo de Lenca returned in mid-1485, his caravel's hull was worn and his crew thin. What he told the king is unknown, but soon after his return, royal records show a sudden interest in reinforcing the Azores Islands as a refitting point for westward voyages. Some historians take this as evidence that Diogo had found traces of the Snow Bartolomeu far out in the Atlantic, perhaps wreckage, perhaps even another vessel carrying part of her cargo. Others argue it was coincidence, part of Portugal's broader strategy of Atlantic expansion. What is certain is that no public announcement of the ship's fate was ever made. Her name remained struck from the records, and her cargo was never accounted for. The trail in official history ends there, but in the dusty corners of Lisbon's maritime archive, there are marginal notes in navigators' logs, written in careful shorthand, that suggest the story did not entirely die. One reads simply, "There is an island where the sand shines at sunset. They say a ship sleeps beneath it." If true, the Snow Bartolomeu's final resting place might not be in the deep sea at all, but in the shallows of some uncharted shore, her chests still sealed, her contents undisturbed for over 5 centuries. And if that is the case, then the mystery shifts from how she was lost to why, and whether her loss was an accident at all. Because in the politics of the late 15th century, it was not unheard of for knowledge to be buried deliberately. And a ship carrying secrets ahead of its time could easily become something worth erasing. The last unanswered question is perhaps the simplest. If someone did recover what the Snow Bartolomeu carried, why has nothing ever surfaced? The centuries between the Snow Bartolomeu's disappearance and the first serious modern search were long enough for most physical traces to vanish. Ships that sink in deep water quickly become part of the seabed, their timbers consumed by worms, their iron corroded into jagged ghosts of their original forms. Storms grind wreckage into unrecognizable fragments. Yet, stories have their own kind of buoyancy. They survive in margins of books, in oral traditions, in the quiet exchanges between historians who know that archives are never truly complete. The Snow Bartolomeu story was one of these too minor for most textbooks. It's too inconvenient for official histories, but always just present enough to resurface when certain maps were unrolled. By the early 20th century, Portugal's maritime history was being re-examined by a new generation of scholars. The age of discovery was no longer just a romantic backdrop for heroic paintings. It was becoming a subject of methodical study. Archivists began sifting through private collections, tracing genealogies of sailors, and cataloging royal correspondence. It was during one such review in the 1920s that a researcher named Enrique Vasconcelos stumbled on an entry in an estate inventory. It listed, among the possessions of a minor noble family, its golden ingots of unusual weight, bearing no mint marks, said to be from the time of King Joao II. No one in the family could explain their origin, and they had been kept not in a vault, but wrapped in oilcloth at the back of a storeroom. They were later melted down for sale, but Vasconcelos noted their odd purity and color, which he described as neither the pale yellow of West African gold nor the reddish hue of Iberian ore. Vasconcelos began to wonder quietly at first if these ingots were remnants of the Snow Bartolomeu's lost cargo. From there, his interest became an obsession. He spent decades tracing rumors of wreckage found on distant shores. 1934, he interviewed an elderly fisherman from the Azores who recalled his grandfather describing a Portuguese ship buried by sand after a great storm. The fisherman insisted that the wreck had been visible at low tide for many years, until another storm covered it again. The location he gave was imprecise, somewhere along a stretch of shifting sandbars notorious for shipwrecks. Many historians dismissed the tale as another conflation of local shipwreck legends, but Vasconcelos noticed that the story's timeline matched the period when Diego de Alenca had supposedly been searching the open Atlantic. If the Snow Bartolomeu had drifted west, damaged but afloat, she might have reached as far as the Azores before running aground. The trouble, of course, was proving it. In the mid-20th century, underwater archaeology was still in its infancy. Wrecks were often discovered by accident, and salvage was more about treasure hunting than preservation. Even if someone had located the Snow Bartolomeu, they might have taken whatever they could carry and left the rest to the sea. By the 1970s, the search gained new life with the advent of side-scan sonar. Expeditions began mapping seabeds in areas once thought too dangerous for navigation. In 1978, a joint Portuguese-American survey off the coast of Snowtone found several wrecks, most from the 17th and 18th centuries, but one site, heavily buried, with only a section of wooden hull and scattered iron fittings, was tentatively dated to the late 15th century. Initial excitement faded when tests on the timber suggested it came from northern Europe, possibly a Hanseatic trading vessel. Still, the discovery kept interest alive. Then, in the 1990s, a diver named Miguel Paredes claimed to have found a cluster of artifacts near a volcanic outcrop southwest of the Azores. Among them was a fragment of carved ivory and a brass astrolabe of unusually fine workmanship. Paredes believed they came from a Portuguese ship, and that their condition suggested they had been buried in sand for centuries, before being uncovered by shifting currents. He brought the astrolabe to Lisbon, where it was examined by experts at the Maritime Museum. The verdict was cautious. The instrument was indeed Portuguese, and its style matched those produced in the 1480s, but without inscriptions or documented link to the Snow Bartolomeu. It was just one more tantalizing clue without confirmation. Paredes refused to reveal the exact location of his find, citing fears of looting. He promised to organize a formal excavation, but funding never materialized. When he died unexpectedly in 2003, whatever coordinates he held went with him, and so the search returned, as it always did, to the archives in 2011. A digitization project at the Torre do Tombo National Archive brought to light a previously overlooked letter from the Spanish ambassador to Portugal, dated late 1485. It referred obliquely to the king's secret ship, which did not return, and the measures taken to ensure its fate remains unknown to those across the border. The phrasing was vague, but some historians interpreted it as evidence that the Snow Bartolomeu's loss, or the nature of her mission, was deliberately concealed from Spain. This was, after all, a time of fierce rivalry between the Iberian crowns over maritime exploration. If the ship had been carrying proof of lands west of Africa, revealing that to Spain would have undermined Portugal's negotiating position. In such a case, even if the wreck were found, its contents might have been quietly retrieved and hidden. This theory that the Snow Bartolomeu was found soon after her loss, but her recovery kept secret, is controversial. Critics point out that secrecy in the late 15th century was difficult to maintain over decades, and that no physical evidence has ever emerged. Supporters counter that royal archives were carefully managed and that erasing inconvenient records was entirely possible in recent years. Technological advances have offered new ways to search. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, can scan large areas of seabed with high resolution. Ground-penetrating radar can map buried structures on land, even beneath dunes. And advanced isotope analysis can determine the origin of metals with remarkable precision. In 2019, ICE, an international team, proposed a new expedition to survey the sandbars of the eastern Azores, using AUVs to map anomalies. The project was delayed by storms and later by funding issues, but preliminary scans revealed several promising shapes beneath the sand. one of which matched the approximate dimensions of a late 5th century carrack. Whether it is the Snow Bartolomeu, another Portuguese vessel, or something else entirely remains unknown. No excavation has yet been approved, partly due to the logistical challenges and partly because the site lies in a protected marine zone. There is, perhaps fittingly, a certain resistance to disturbing whatever lies there. For those drawn to maritime mysteries, the Snow Bartolomeu story is not just about a lost ship. It is about the way history can hide in plain sight, in overlooked margins of documents, in rumors repeated by fishermen, in the stubborn absence of proof. It is about the possibility that some parts of the past were never meant to be fully recovered. Some believe the real treasure she carried was not gold or ivory, but knowledge, a map perhaps, or a written account of lands seen but not yet claimed. If such an object existed and was retrieved in secret, it could have shaped the course of exploration without ever entering the public record. Others think the ship's mystery is more ordinary. A storm, a grounding, a loss like so many others, inflated into legend by the scarcity of facts, and yet the image lingers. A lone carrack, battered but afloat, her cargo sealed in the hold, drifting into waters where no chart existed. It's a sudden grounding on a hidden shore, it's a tide rising, bearing her inch by inch until only sand and silence remained. If she lies there, still, her timbers locked in the grip of sediment, she might be better preserved than any wreck in open water. Inside her chests, the air stale and heavy might still carry the scent of the last port she touched. No diver has seen it. No archaeologist has lifted the lid. No one has confirmed whether the ship's story ends in ordinary ruin or in art. Something stranger. Perhaps that is why the Snow Bartolomeu still haunts the edges of maritime history. It is not a tale of discovery, but of its absence, a reminder that some questions are most enduring when they remain unanswered, and so the search continues. Not always in the water, but in the minds of those who cannot resist the thought that, somewhere beneath the shifting skin of sand, a ship sleeps, and with it, a chapter of history that no one alive has ever read. In the late 15th century, Portugal's Atlantic coastline was not the polished, bustling strip of cruise terminals and tourist cafes it is today. It was raw, wind-cut, and temperamental, shaped as much by storms as by human ambition. Fishing villages clung to coves, and fortified ports crouched behind walls that kept out more than just invaders. They shielded fragile harbors from the relentless force of the sea. One of these ports, known in contemporary records as Porto das Águas, was small enough to escape most maps of the time, but important enough to serve as a departure point for ships that needed discretion. Located somewhere south of Lisbon, though its exact site is now the subject of debate, Porto das Águas was more a logistical convenience than a political hub. Its claim to significance lay in the fact that it had deep water access just a short distance from shore, making it ideal for loading heavily laden ships without requiring the infrastructure of a major city. This was the kind of harbor where the Snow Bartolomeu or her contemporaries might have quietly taken on cargo before embarking on voyages that were not meant to draw attention. It was, according to the few surviving accounts, a modest place, a cluster of warehouses built of rough stone, a short wharf of timber and iron spikes, and a watchtower that doubled as a lighthouse when torches were lit at its summit. The rest was sand, scrub grass, and the constant hiss of Atlantic waves. Its people lived simply, though their work was anything but easy. Fishermen mended nets in the lee of the warehouses. Carpenters repaired holes worn thin by long journeys. And there were always porters, men who carried crates, bales, and barrels from ship to shore and back again, their shoulders bearing the literal weight of the maritime empire that was slowly expanding beyond sight of Europe. The records that mention Porto das Águas do so in the most practical of terms. There are shipping manifests noting the transfer of goods: pepper from Calicut, hides from Guinea, salt cod from Newfoundland. There are lists of repairs made to visiting vessels, purchases of rope and pitch, and the occasional notation of fees paid to local officials. But then, the early 1490s, the records simply stop. There is no entry announcing the port's closure. No formal decree disbanding its operations. Simply vanishes from the paper trail. The absence is easy to miss if one is looking only at Lisbon's grander archives. It was first noted in the 18th century by a cleric compiling a history of Portugal's lesser-known harbors. He remarked, with mild puzzlement, that Porto das Águas appears to have been in use until a certain year, after which its name is no longer found, as though the sea had swallowed it. That phrase, as though the sea had swallowed, it became more than a figure of speech for later researchers. By the 19th century, coastal erosion was recognized as a powerful force. Villages had been lost to shifting dunes, farms reduced to marshland, entire stretches of shoreline rearranged by storms. It seemed plausible that Porto das Águas had simply been one of these casualties. Yet, there was another detail that kept the mystery alive. A handful of documents from Lisbon's royal court, dated just months before the port's disappearance from records, referencing special preparations at the southern harbor for a voyage of highest discretion. The nature of this voyage is unknown. No ship's name is attached to the instructions, and no surviving record confirms the cargo or destination. The orders mention only that the vessel was to be supplied without delay, and that its departure was to be witnessed by a trusted agent of the crown. It is tempting, perhaps too tempting, to connect this nameless ship with the one said to have sunk before Columbus's first voyage. The timeline fits, the geography fits, and the aura of secrecy matches the tone of other documents from the period, involving expeditions meant to keep Portugal's discoveries out of Spanish ears. But Porto das Águas offers one more twist, according to local tradition, passed down in fragments among coastal families. The harbor did not merely fall into disuse, it was destroyed in a single night. Accounts vary in the details, but the core of the story is the same. A violent storm struck, bringing with it not only high winds, but a sudden, massive surge of water. The tide rose far beyond its normal bounds, flooding the warehouses and sweeping away the wooden pier. Ships at anchor were torn from their moorings. By morning, the shoreline had shifted. What had been deep water beside the wharf was now a sand-choked inlet. Whether this was the result of a storm, undersea landslide, or some combination of the two is unclear. Modern geologists note that certain parts of Portugal's coast are prone to rapid seabed changes when earthquakes or subsurface collapses occur. In the right conditions, a harbor could be rendered useless almost overnight. If Porto das Águas had been the staging ground for a secretive voyage, the destruction of its harbor in the same season could have compounded the mystery. Without a functioning port, there would be no return to normal operations. The merchants and shipwrights would move elsewhere. The site would be abandoned, its usefulness gone. And if, just if, the secretive vessel that departed had been lost soon after, its memory might have been doubly erased, once by the silencing of its port, and again by the erasure of its part, and again by the erasure of its melencha. Name from official accounts. Of course, there is another possibility. The storm that supposedly destroyed Porto das Águas might have claimed the ship itself. In that case, the two disappearances would be one and the same. But here, the trail fragments. The few surviving maps from the era either omit the harbor or show only generic coastal outlines. The local terrain has changed so dramatically over the centuries that locating the exact spot is difficult. Some researchers believe the site now lies beneath farmland several kilometers inland, cut off from the sea by a buildup of sediment. Others think it lies beneath the ocean, its ruins buried under layers of shifting sand. In either case, no confirmed excavation has been attempted. The area believed to hold the remains is part of a protected coastal zone, and while archaeologists have surveyed nearby sites, the absence of definitive proof has kept Puerto das Aguas low on the list of funded priorities. This leaves the harbor in a peculiar category, not forgotten, but not actively sought. Mentioned in passing in specialist literature, evoked occasionally in conferences about pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages, but never brought fully into the spotlight, which is perhaps fitting. Ports like Puerto das Aguas existed to be functional, not famous. Their purpose was to serve the ships and goods passing through, not to leave monuments. Without ships, they faded. Without records, they vanished. And yet, somewhere beyond the reach of tides or beneath them, the timbers of a wharf may still lie darkened with tar. The stones of the warehouses might still hold faint traces of salt. The mortar between them crumbled to sand. And perhaps, if the more ambitious theories are correct, a wreck may rest nearby. Its holds sealed with silt, its cargo untouched, since the night both ship and harbor slipped from the map. Whether that cargo was simply spices and trade goods or something altogether stranger, that is the question that lingers unanswered as the wind still combs the Portuguese coast where a port once stood, centuries after Puerto das Aguas had slipped from written records. The question of its fate lay dormant, neither wholly forgotten nor urgently pursued. It existed in the half-light of obscure history, the kind of detail that might intrigue a passing antiquarian, but rarely attract the sustained effort of scholars or governments, that began to change in the mid-20th century, when coastal archaeology in Portugal began to move beyond the excavation of medieval castles and Roman villas and into the more elusive territory of ports, fish processing stations, and ancient harbors. These were not the grand monuments of empire. They were workspaces, built of whatever materials were at hand, often designed to be functional rather than permanent. They rarely survived the centuries intact, but they were essential to understanding how coastal societies lived and traded. One of the first modern references to Puerto das Aguas came in 1954, when a maritime historian named Joe Manuel Correa published a brief but tantalizing note in the Revista de Historia Náutica, while combing through shipping records in Lisbon's Torre do Tombo archives. He had come across 3 separate mentions of the harbor, all dated between 1489 and 1492, describing it as a point of embarkation for special cargo under royal seal. The term was vague, but its repetition across multiple documents caught Correa's attention in his article. Correa suggested that Puerto das Aguas might have played a role in Portugal's pre-Columbian expeditions along the African coast or even toward the Atlantic islands. He stopped short of making any claim about voyages to the Americas. But he did note that the timing of the final entry, mere months before Columbus sailed under the Spanish flag, was curious. That curiosity lay dormant for another generation. By the 1970s, Portugal's coastline had become the focus of more systematic archaeological surveys. Researchers were mapping submerged structures, documenting erosion rates, even using aerial photography to spot faint traces of ancient walls and jetties beneath fields and sand dunes. It was during one of these surveys that a young geographer named Helena Duarte became interested in the vanished harbor. While reviewing aerial images of a stretch of coast south of Setúbal, she noticed a pattern in the sandbars just offshore, a crescent-shaped formation that did not seem to match the natural contours of the seabed. The arc was faint, but regular, as if outlining the remains of an artificial breakwater. Duarte compared the images with historical maps and found that the area in question corresponded roughly to where some 18th century coastal charts marked old port ruins. Those charts, in turn, were based on even older pilot books though the names and details often shifted. Still, the alignment was suggestive enough that she proposed a preliminary field survey when divers from the University of Lisbon's Marine Archaeology Unit visited the site in 1978. They found little in the way of intact structures. The seabed was unstable, the sand shifting with every storm. Scattered across the area were timbers that, when dated by dendrochronology, proved to be from the late 15th century. These were not shipwreck timbers. Their cuts and joinery suggested pier construction, squared beams, drilled for iron bolts, cross braces, angled for load bearing, and they were found in positions that matched the arc Duarte had identified from the aerial images. It was not enough to declare the discovery of Porto das Aguas, but it was enough to keep the search alive. Over the next 2 decades, small grants funded occasional dives, side scans, sonar sweeps, and interviews with local fishermen whose nets had snagged on submerged wood or stone. The story among these fishermen was always the same. Sometimes, after a storm, strange objects surfaced a length of tarred rope, a fragment of carved oak, a pottery shard. Most were discarded. A few made their way to Duarte's collection. The pottery was telling. Several pieces matched late medieval Portuguese styles, but one, a small, heavily encrusted jar, bore glazed patterns that suggested North African origin. Another, more fragmentary, was identified tentatively as Andalusian. Together, they hinted at a harbor that handled goods from multiple regions. It's consistent with the picture painted by those sparse archival shipping records. Yet the most striking find came in 1993 when a team running a magnetometer sweep detected a dense anomaly just offshore. The readings suggested a concentration of metal, perhaps iron, buried beneath several meters of sand. Optimism surged briefly. Could this be part of the special cargo referenced in the 15th century orders? Anomaly lay within the zone Duarte believed had once been the deep water berth of the harbor. But excavation permits proved difficult to obtain, as the site fell within a newly designated marine conservation area. By the time approval was granted for a limited investigation, a winter storm had reshaped the seabed once more, and the anomaly signature had shifted, possibly buried deeper or scattered entirely. For Duarte, the frustration was palpable. She had spent nearly 2 decades chasing the outline of a harbor that existed mostly in hints and eroded memory. The anomaly had been her closest brush with something tangible, and now it was like Porto das Aguas itself, out of reach. In the meantime, the theoretical stakes were rising. Across the Atlantic world, historians were revisiting the question of whether Europeans, and specifically the Portuguese, had made voyages westward before Columbus. While the evidence remained circumstantial, it was increasingly clear that both Spain and Portugal were deeply invested in controlling the flow of geographical knowledge. Ships left, ships returned, and not all of them were recorded in ways visible to modern researchers. This secrecy was not unusual. To the age of exploration, maps were state secrets. Routes were guarded like military plans. Quays and ports like Porto das Aguas could function as quiet staging grounds for expeditions whose very existence was classified. Some researchers went further, suggesting that the destruction of the harbor may not have been entirely natural. Could it have been intentionally dismantled after serving its purpose, to erase any trace of the voyage it had supported? The idea was speculative, but not impossible. In an era when monarchs ordered the burning of maps and the suppression of petition of explorers' journals, the physical removal of a harbor's infrastructure was not unthinkable. If so, the question becomes, what could have been so important or so dangerous that it warranted erasing an entire port? The answer, if it exists, may lie in the sea. Beneath the shifting sands could rest not only the remains of wharves and warehouses, but perhaps the bones of the very ship that vanished, the one whose departure marked Porto das Aguas' final appearance in the records. If the vessel went down nearby, it might still carry the sealed holds and cargo that sparked so much later speculation. But the Atlantic is an unforgiving keeper of secrets. Salt, current, and time are relentless. Even if the wreck survives, it may be too fragile to recover without destroying it. And if the cargo was of a kind meant never to be found, artifacts from lands not yet claimed, perhaps then the deliberate weight of secrecy may have been as effective as the ocean's silt in keeping it hidden by the late 2000s. Technology had improved. Side-scan sonar offered finer resolution, and sub-bottom profilers could read through layers of sediment. Duarte, now retired, passed her notes to a younger team who resumed surveys of the suspected site. Their results hinted at multiple anomalies, some consistent with shipwreck debris, others with large stone blocks that could have formed part of a quay or breakwater. And yet, funding remained thin, and priorities often shifted toward more visible heritage projects. Tourists preferred castles to sunken harbors. Municipal councils preferred investments that could be photographed and promoted. Tata Aguas stayed under the water, under the sand, under the layer of disinterest that so often covers small but tantalizing pieces of history. Still, among the divers and archaeologists who have touched its remnants, there remains the quiet conviction that something important happened there. The early 1490s, something that connected a nondescript port to the wider web of secrecy and competition that defined Europe's leap into the Atlantic. What exactly that something was is still waiting in the dark, beyond the reach of tides and bureaucracy alike. And the question that hangs as persistent as the surf is whether it will be found in time, or whether it will shift once more into deeper obscurity, like the harbor itself.
The winter seas along Portugal's southwest coast have a temperament of their own. On calm days, the Atlantic lies glassy and still, as if in mockery of its reputation. But when the wind shifts, and it always does, the waves arrive in long, heavy sets that do not simply break against the shore. They rearrange it. For centuries, this constant reshaping has worked both for and against those searching for Porto das Aguas. On the one hand, storms can strip away whole meters of sand in a single night, revealing timbers or stonework unseen for decades. On the other hand, the very next tide can bury those same clues under a fresh layer of sediment, locking them away again for years. By the early 2010s, the archaeologists who had taken over from Helena Duarte faced a narrowing window of opportunity. Climate change models suggested that sea levels along this stretch of coast could rise by up to 0.5 meter over the next century, and storm surges were already becoming more frequent. Each year, the combination of erosion and deposition altered the seafloor in unpredictable ways. For a team trying to locate a fragile 15th century wreck, this was a cruel paradox. The same forces that might reveal it could also destroy it. The new lead archaeologist, Miguel Antunes, was a methodical man in his early 40s who had grown up diving in the calmer bays of the Algarve. He had inherited not just Duarte's notes, but also her quiet determination to keep the project alive despite years of sporadic funding. Antunes believed that any discovery at Porto das Aguas would likely come not from a dramatic eureka moment, but from the slow accumulation of data points, small anomalies, cross-referenced and resurveyed until a pattern emerged. His approach was to focus less on the romantic idea of finding the ship, and more on mapping the entire drowned, the landscape of the harbor. If the ship had indeed gone down nearby, it would be part of a broader archaeological picture, one that included key structures, anchorages, cargo handling areas, and perhaps even the detritus of everyday harbor life, broken amphorae, discarded rope, lost tools. This required patience. Side-scan sonar sweeps were repeated in different seasons, because what was visible in summer might vanish in winter. Sub-bottom profiling created cross-sections of sediment layers, revealing where heavier materials had sunk over time. Divers, retrieved samples from specific anomalies, careful to disturb as little as possible. One of the earliest confirmed finds under Antena's leadership was a cluster of stone blocks arranged in a line parallel to the shore. Each block weighed between 200 and 400 kilograms and bore chisel marks consistent with late medieval masonry. They were too regular to be random boulders, and their orientation suggested they might have formed the foundation of a jetty or breakwater nearby. In slightly deeper water came the discovery of iron concretions, corroded masses in which the original objects were no longer easily identifiable, but whose shape and composition hinted at tools or fittings. One lump, once X-rayed, revealed the faint outline of a large iron hook, possibly part of a crane or lifting mechanism for cargo. But the most intriguing find of that season was a small, barrel-shaped container, sealed with pitch. Its outer wood had eroded badly, but the pitch layer was surprisingly intact. Laboratory analysis indicated that the container had once held a dense, resinous substance, possibly a preservative or sealant. Traces of plant oils suggested origins outside Portugal, perhaps from North Africa or the eastern Mediterranean. The find was small in scale, but it hinted at the kind of goods that might have passed through Porto das Águas, and it aligned neatly with Duarte's earlier pottery evidence of a trade network that stretched beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Still, none of these finds answered the central question: what had happened to the ship that vanished from the records in the early 1490s? The team's attention returned again and again to a cluster of magnetic anomalies first recorded in the late 1990s. These lay slightly offshore from the presumed line of the old quay, in an area where the seabed sloped gently into deeper water. They were irregular in shape and depth, but several were elongated, roughly matching the dimensions of a medium-sized caravel. In 2014, with a rare infusion of grant money, Antoon secured a remotely operated vehicle rove, capable of working in the low-visibility, high-selt conditions of the site. The ROV's cameras sent back grainy footage of dark shapes under the sand, not clear enough to identify, but suggestive of wood preserved in anaerobic layers. Excavation permits were once again the stumbling block. This time, the delays were compounded by competing claims over jurisdiction. The site lay just inside a boundary between municipal and national heritage oversight, and both bodies were reluctant to commit resources without certainty of a major find. Months stretched into years, and by the time the permits came through, winter storms had struck again. The next ROV survey revealed that the largest anomaly had partially collapsed, with splintered timbers jutting from the sand. Samples taken for carbon dating confirmed a late 15th century origin, but they also showed signs of burning, a discovery that deepened the mystery. Why would a ship sink within its own harbor, and why would its timbers show evidence of fire? Accidental harbor fires were not unheard of, but they typically started on shore. Was the vessel deliberately burned before being scuttled? In maritime history, burning a ship was often a way to ensure its cargo, or its secrets, could not be captured. If Porto das Águas had indeed been used for a politically sensitive voyage, this might explain both the fire and the sudden disappearance of the harbor from records. But that explanation leads to more questions. What cargo could have been so compromising? Why destroy the vessel in its home waters rather than at sea? And who would have given the order? Among the more speculative theories, one stood out, whispered among a small circle of historians, but rarely put into print. It suggested that the ship had returned, not from Africa or the Canaries, but from farther west, carrying objects or knowledge that, if revealed, could have undermined the political negotiations then underway between Spain and Portugal over spheres of influence. In that delicate moment, just before the Treaty of Tordesillas, in 1494, carved the Atlantic into zones of exploration, a premature revelation could have shifted power. If the Portuguese crown believed it had reason to hide such a voyage, dismantling the harbor and erasing its records would have been consistent with a strategy of silence. It is a compelling idea, but like so many compelling ideas in history, it rests on fragments, scorched timbers, ambiguous documents, half-buried stonework. Today, the site remains in limbo, protected enough to prevent unauthorized salvage, but without the funding for full excavation. Each year Ontoon's team conducts brief surveys, logging the changes wrought by the sea. Sometimes they find new fragments, a bronze nail here, a piece of charred rope there. Each is catalogued, photographed, and stored, a tiny piece of a puzzle that may never be complete. The local fishing community, for the most part, has grown used to the presence of the archaeologists. Occasionally, a net will snag on something heavy, and a fisherman will quietly pass the find to Ontoons. One elderly skipper once handed over a smooth, fist-sized stone, bored clean through with a circular hole. It was, Ontoons recognized, an anchor stone of a type used in small craft centuries ago. Perhaps it had nothing to do with the vanished ship, or perhaps it had been part of the harbor's working life. Standing on the shore at low tide, looking out over the line where the waves break, it is almost impossible to imagine that an active port once lay here bustling with voices, the creak of rigging, the thump of cargo being shifted. The sea has reclaimed it so thoroughly that even the coastline itself has moved, and yet, somewhere beneath those waves, the remains of the ship, and perhaps its sealed holds, still rest. Whether they hold mundane goods, or something extraordinary, they have been hidden for more than 5 centuries. The question now is whether they will be uncovered by human hands in the years ahead, or whether the Atlantic will keep them forever, turning wood to silt and iron to powder, until there is nothing left to tell.
In the autumn of 1892, Portuguese salvage crew working off the coast near Figueira da Foz brought up something unusual from the wreck of a small vessel. Not gold, not weapons, not even intact pottery, but a bundle of sodden paper bound in leather and encased in a thin, brittle layer of what looked like hardened wax. The wreck itself was of no great historical note at the time. Local records suggested it had been a coastal trader, possibly lost in the late 16th or early 17th century. Most of its cargo had been common to the period: salt, barrels of fish, perhaps olive oil or wine. But the book, once it had dried enough to handle, was clearly older than the wreck, and it was not written in any easily recognizable hand. The salvagers, more interested in selling the lead from the ship's ballast than in old papers, sold the book to an antiques dealer in Lisbon. From there, it passed quietly into the hands of a minor noble family, kept it on a shelf in their country estate for nearly 2 decades. By the time it surfaced again in the early 20th century, it had already acquired a reputation as a curiosity, the ledger no one could read. At first glance, the book appeared to be a merchant's account ledger. It had columns, figures, and notations in the margins, but the script was odd, not quite cursive, not quite block, with characters that seemed to combine elements of Latin, Greek, and something more angular, perhaps a cipher. Even more puzzling was the fact that some entries were made in red ink, others in black, and still others in what appeared to be a faded purple. The pages were thick, made from a coarse fibrous material that was neither standard European paper nor parchment. Analysis decades later would reveal it was likely a blend of linen and hemp fibers, beaten into a pulp and pressed, a technique known in parts of the Mediterranean, but rare in 15th century Portugal. The binding leather was cracked, but still supple, and the waxy coating on the outside appeared to be a kind of resin, possibly applied to waterproof it by 1910. Portugal was in political turmoil, and the noble family sold off parts of its estate to cover debts. The ledger was bought by a university professor in Coimbra who specialized in paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. Professor Antonio Rebello recognized that the numbers in the ledger were written in a style common to the late 15th century, and that some of the words, when they could be deciphered, were in archaic Portuguese. but others were in what seemed to be an entirely different language. Perhaps a trade pigeon or an encoded script meant only for insiders. What struck Rebello most was the date at the top of one page, Anno Domini 1493. That year was significant. It was the year Columbus returned from his first voyage across the Atlantic. It was also a time of feverish maritime activity in both Spain and Portugal, as each sought to expand its reach and secure exclusive rights to new territories. Rebello became convinced that the ledger was older than the shipwreck that had contained it, perhaps decades older, and that it had been carried aboard as a reference or archive. If so, it might contain records of voyages, transactions, case, or even discoveries that had been deliberately kept secret. But reading it proved nearly impossible. The red ink entries seemed to follow one set of abbreviations, the black another, and the purple yet another still. Some lines appeared to be simple records for barrels, olive oil, 25 race, but then the same entry would be followed by a series of symbols, triangles, circles, and small marks that looked like stylized waves. Were these shipping marks, ciphers for destinations, or something else entirely? In 1912, Rebello published a short article in an academic journal outlining his preliminary observations. He speculated that the ledger might have belonged to a private merchant operating under royal license, one who dealt not only in conventional goods, but also in rarer, more politically sensitive items. Such merchants, he noted, often kept two sets of records, one for public inspection and one heavily coded for their own use. The article drew little attention at the time. Portugal's academic circles were small, and maritime history was still considered a niche subject. The ledger was placed in the university's archives, where it sat quietly for decades, brought out occasionally for students to puzzle over. It wasn't until the 1960s when advances in photographic techniques allowed scholars to enhance faded ink that new details emerged. Ultraviolet photography revealed that beneath some of the red ink entries there were faint erasures, earlier writing scraped away or rubbed out, then overwritten. In some cases, the underlying words appeared to be in plain Portuguese, naming ports along the African coast. In others, they were stranger still, single words or short phrases that matched no known language. One such word, repeated several times, was galera. On the surface, it could mean galley, a type of ship, but in this context, the placement suggested it might be a code word for a place, a person, or even a type of cargo. By the late 20th century, the ledger had attracted the attention of maritime historians who were beginning to reconsider the early history of transatlantic voyages. Some argued that Portuguese sailors may have reached parts of the Americas before Columbus, and that records of such voyages might have been suppressed to avoid conflict with Spain before the Treaty of Tordesillas. If the ledger contained coded references to such a voyage, it would be an extraordinary piece of evidence. Yet every attempt to fully decode it ran into the same wall. Too many unknowns, without knowing the merchant's personal system. It was impossible to tell whether a particular symbol meant Brazelwood or storm damage, whether a triangle stood for a bay or a specific political contact. In 2003, the ledger was digitized and made available to a wider range of researchers. Linguists, code breakers, and even amateur cryptographers took a crack at it. Some claimed partial breakthroughs, identifying patterns in the numbers that might correspond to distances or cargo weights. Others argued that the symbols were a kind of shorthand unique to this merchant, and that without other examples, the code would remain unbreakable. One intriguing development came from a historian of Mediterranean trade routes, who noticed that some of the symbols in the ledger closely resembled marks used by Genoese traders in the 14th century. This suggested that the merchant or his forebears might have learned his trade in Italy before moving to Portugal. If true, it could explain the hybrid nature of the writing. with its mix of linguistic influences. Still, the central mystery remains. Why was the ledger on that small coastal trader centuries after it was written? Was it being transported for safekeeping, perhaps to a new owner? Was it part of a family archive being moved inland? Or was someone, even in the 17th century, still using it as a reference for routes and contacts known only to a few? The most tantalizing question of all is whether the ledger was connected in any way to the ship that vanished at Porto das Águas, the one some believe returned from a voyage beyond the known world. No direct link has been proven. The overlap in dates and the secrecy surrounding both makes the possibility hard to ignore. And so, the merchant's ledger sits today in a climate-controlled room in Coimbra, preserved but still unreadable. Pages turn slowly under the hands of archivists, the faint smell of resin still clinging to the leather. The symbols stare back, as if waiting for someone with the right key to unlock their meaning. If that key is ever found, what will it reveal? A mundane record of salted fish and woolens, or a map of transactions and journeys that history has chosen or been made to forget? By the early years of the 21st century, the merchant's ledger had acquired a reputation as one of Portugal's strangest maritime artifacts. Not because it was lavishly decorated or linked to a famous name, but because it stubbornly refused to give up its meaning. It was small enough to be overlooked, obscure enough to remain out of the hands of high-profile collectors. And yet, for a certain kind of historian or codebreaker, it was exactly the sort of challenge that gnawed at the mind for decades. The renewed interest began, oddly enough, not in Portugal, but in Canada. In 2003, a linguistics professor at the University of Toronto, Dr. Helen Dorchester, was browsing through a new online archive of Iberian manuscripts when she came across high-resolution images of the ledger. She was not a maritime historian. By trade, her specialty was comparative orthography, the study of how scripts evolved across different languages. Oshivi immediately struck by the mixture of forms on the page. Some letter shapes were clearly derived from the late medieval Portuguese cursive hand. Others leaned toward the mercantile scripts of northern Italy. A few looked almost like shorthand symbols, while still others had a distinctly abstract, emblem-like quality. Dorchester recognized that such mixtures often arose in border regions, or among communities of traders who moved constantly between linguistic zones. But here, the mix was unusually dense, suggesting deliberate selection rather than mere habit. She began corresponding with the archivists in Coimbra, who were by now accustomed to fielding inquiries from around the world. The images she studied were sharp enough to reveal tiny imperfections, the way the ink bled into the paper fibers, the uneven pressure of the pen strokes. These details suggested to her that at least 3 different people had written in the ledger over time, each with slightly different habits. That, in itself, was intriguing. It implied that the ledger had not been a singly used document, but a kind of ongoing record, maintained over years or even decades, a lua that might explain the layering of languages and scripts as clerks changed. So, did the handwriting, and possibly the codes, but it also made deciphering the text vastly harder. A cipher created by one hand might not apply to a page written 50 pages later by another. Around the same time, a small but dedicated online community of amateur codebreakers took up the challenge. The rise of internet forums in the early 2000s created spaces where historians, hobbyists, and cryptography enthusiasts could pool their knowledge. The merchant's ledger quickly became a recurring thread in one such group. Maritime Mysteries, whose members included retired naval officers, archivists, and even a few professional codebreakers. They began by cataloging every unique symbol in the ledger, creating a database of triangles, circles, loops, and wave-like marks. One member, an Italian researcher named Paolo Mancini, noted that some of the marks closely matched those found in 14th and 15th century Genoese port records, where they were used as merchants' marks, personal symbols identifying the owner of a cargo. Others matched symbols found on shipping documents from the Canary Islands in the decades before Columbus's voyage. If true, it suggested that the ledger's creator had either traveled widely or inherited the coding system from predecessors who had. But it also raised a puzzle. Why mix personal merchants' marks, which were meant to be recognizable, with what seemed to be a private cipher? As the group dug deeper, they began to notice patterns in the color-coded ink entries. Red entries, often clustered around months that corresponded to favorable sailing seasons, late spring and early autumn, while black entries seemed to note transactions made in port during the off-season. Purple entries were rarer and tended to appear alongside unusually large numbers. One theory was that the purple ink signaled high-value cargoes or particularly sensitive deals. Then came a breakthrough, or what seemed like one, a member of member, the group who went by the username Old Salt. Notice that some of the ledger's numerical entries matched the distances between certain Atlantic ports, measured in Portuguese leagues. If the numbers represented voyage legs rather than quantities of goods, then the ledger might be less of an inventory and more of a log of movements, a shipping route hidden in plain sight. But when they tried to apply this system to the whole book, the theory broke down. Not all the numbers matched known port distances. Some were far too large, others far too small. And then there were the pages with no numbers at all, only strings of symbols and occasional single words like galera or tor. In 2008, University of Coimbra hosted a small symposium dedicated to maritime records and hidden histories. Among the invited speakers was a British naval historian, Dr. Samuel Plowright, who had spent years studying the coded journals of Elizabethan privateers. In his talk, he pointed out that many merchant ciphers were polyglot systems, not single codes, but layered ones, with substitutions, abbreviations, and symbolic markers all used together. Breaking such a system without a key was exponentially harder than solving a simple substitution cipher. Plowright examined the ledger in person during the symposium and left convinced that it was, at least in part, a navigation aid. If this was only an inventory, he remarked, the coding would be overkill. But if it was a record of where to find certain goods or certain people in ports or open record keeping would invite competitors, that would explain everything. Its idea that the ledger might be a guide to a network of trusted contacts and safe harbors fit with known practices of the time. Merchants who dealt in politically sensitive commodities, such as slaves, exotic dyes, or rare woods, often kept such lists. These were never meant for public eyes and were sometimes disguised as mundane accounts. Still, nothing could be proven without breaking the code. And so the ledger remained what it had always been, a tangle of hints without resolution. In 2012, a new technology entered the picture, hyperspectral imaging. This allowed researchers to photograph the pages across dozens of wavelengths, revealing ink traces invisible to the human eye. When the Coimbra team applied this method to the ledger, they discovered something entirely unexpected on several pages. Beneath both the visible text and the faint erasures noted decades earlier, there were yet older markings, as if the paper had been reused from another document. These ghostly undertexts were fragmentary. One seemed to mention Ilha Grande, Great Island, in clear, unambiguous Portuguese. Another fragment contained what might have been a date, 1489, if the ledger's paper had once held records from 1489. Then it predated Columbus's first voyage by 3 years. More importantly, it hinted that whoever wrote in it had access to maritime information before the official age of discovery began. And yet, the fragments were too incomplete to place definitively. They might have referred to known Atlantic islands like Madeira or the Azores, or they might have been code for somewhere further west, a place known to only a handful of sailors. As the 2010s wore on, the ledger attracted a new generation of attention from open source intelligence communities, where amateurs and professionals collaborate on difficult problems. Some brought advanced statistical analysis to bear on the text, looking for frequency patterns that might hint at underlying words. Others compared the ledger symbols to every known set of merchant marks, from the Baltic to the Levant. A few even speculated, controversially, that the ledger might have been a deliberate fake, created in a later century to mimic older records. But the chemical analysis of the ink and paper, conducted independently by 2 laboratories, confirmed that the materials were consistent with a late 15th century origin. By 2019, the working consensus among serious researchers was that the ledger was authentic and that its code could only be broken if another document using the same system were found. Without such a Rosetta Stone, the symbols would remain tantalizing but opaque, and so the merchant's ledger continues to sit in its protective case, its pages turned carefully under the watch of archivists. The resin on its leather still faintly glistens under the light. The symbols remain inscrutable, but in the quiet rooms of archives and in the restless corners of internet forums, the work continues. Each new eye that studies the ledger looks for the same thing, the crack in the wall, the small pattern that might finally reveal the whole. If that pattern is found, will it open onto a simple truth, or will it lead, as some fear, to a place on the map that was never meant to be seen? By the start of the 2020s, the merchant's ledger had moved beyond being a curiosity known only to specialists. It had begun to appear in small newspaper features and history podcasts, usually introduced with the same question: what could possibly be written here that required such care to hide? Yet, despite the growing public intrigue, the scholarly mood was one of quiet resignation. The last 20 years had brought better imaging techniques, more sophisticated pattern analysis, and a steady stream of new eyes. Yet the text still stood like a locked gate, its hinges unmoved, in Queenber's reading room. The ledger sat in a climate-controlled glass case, the leather binding supported by a custom cradle. Researchers still had to make appointments to handle the original, and most worked from digital scans. A few insisted that the real page in front of them the faint smell of centuries-old resin. The uneven surface of the paper might yield something that images never could. Others saw that as a romantic nonsense. The ledger's secrets, they said, would be cracked by data, not by sentiment. But there was one line of thought that resisted even the most advanced technology: the possibility that the ledger had never been meant to be read in the usual sense at all. The theory of the cargo map. The first to publicly voice this idea was Dr. Samuel Plowright, the same British historian who had spoken about layered codes in maritime documents years earlier. In a 2021 interview for a BBC radio history program, he explained it plainly. We keep looking at this object as though it's a book of words in disguise, But in the late 15th century, many merchant records were not linguistic in the way we expect. They were visual mnemonics. The symbols might mean nothing to anyone who wasn't there when they were drawn. They might correspond to a cargo hold's layout, or to a memory system known only to one captain and his factor. According to this view, the ledger was not so much a code as a set of prompts, visual shorthand to trigger the memory of the person who wrote it. That person knew that a certain triangle stood for salt cod in the forward hold, and a certain wave symbol meant cloth bolts stacked beneath the deck. Then nothing more was needed. Without that lived memory, there was no key to recover. Plowright's suggestion didn't sit well with those who had invested years in cryptographic analysis. If the ledger could never be solved in a way that produced a clear text, then much of the ongoing work was chasing a ghost, as others saw it as a realistic assessment. After all, not every historical record is made to be legible centuries later. The dangerous, possibility-separate debate had begun to brew, one less about how to break the ledger's code, and more about whether it should be broken at all. This might sound odd until one remembers the possibility raised years earlier, that the ledger contained the coordinates or descriptions of a place, known to a small group of sailors before the official European discovery of the Americas. A Portuguese journalist writing for a maritime heritage magazine floated a provocative scenario. This book contains references to a pre-Columbian transatlantic route, and if such a place still lies unclaimed in maritime law, then revealing it might trigger a scramble, legal, political, and commercial. Some dismissed this as pure speculation. Others countered that history had shown how archaeological sites, once publicized, could be looted within weeks. A ledger leading to a wreck site full of gold, silver, or rare artifacts would be an irresistible target for treasure hunters. The archivists at Queenborough, while cautious in their public statements, quietly tightened their security. A resolution. Scans of the ledger were no longer freely downloadable. Requests had to be vetted. The reasoning was given in bureaucratic language, preservation concerns, but those close to the matter suspected the deeper fear was about what might happen if an amateur suddenly spotted something everyone else had missed. The circle of the patient still, a small inner circle of researchers persisted, moving at the pace of centuries-old scholarship rather than viral internet hunts. One of them was Dr. Helen Dorchester, the linguist who had first spotted the unusual mixture of scripts 2 decades earlier. By 2022, she had retired from teaching, but continued her ledger work privately, corresponding with a handful of trusted colleagues. Her method was deceptively slow. She wasn't trying to solve the ledger outright, but to understand the habits of its writers. She charted how certain symbols changed form across the pages, how ink density varied at the start or end of voyages, even how the pen strokes became shakier on what might have been stormy days at sea. Over time, she built a kind of profile, not of the code, but of the people. One hand favored tight, compressed lines as though saving space. Another sprawled across the page, as if writing in calm, dry conditions. These details, she argued, might one day suggest identities when cross-referenced with other merchant records. Her work echoed an old truth in maritime history. Sometimes the margins, the way something is written, rather than the words themselves, carry the deepest meaning. The ledger's journey after the wreck. The ledger's known path after the shipwreck was patchy but revealing. Sometime in the late 16th century, it appeared in an estate inventory of a Lisbon merchant family, listed blandly as Livro de Contas, Antigua's Book of Old Accounts. From there, it vanished from records for over a century, reappearing only in the late 1700s in a private library in Porto. By the mid-19th century, it had passed into the hands of a local historian who tried to donate it to the National Archives, but was refused, possibly because no one could read it. Finally, the early 20th century, it was acquired by the University of Queenborough's Maritime Collection, where it has remained. Each transition likely stripped away some part of its original context, the oral explanations, the accompanying documents, the shared memory of those who once knew its language. Could it be deciphered after all? By 2023, a quiet optimism returned. In some circles, thanks to advances in machine learning. A research group at the University of Lisbon began training an AI model on thousands of pages of late medieval merchant records, hoping that it could identify statistical similarities invisible to human readers. In one experiment, the model suggested that certain recurring symbol clusters in the ledger were statistically similar to place names on 15th century Portuguese maps. For example, a particular combination of a triangle, a wave mark, and a loop occurred in positions where one might expect the word Madeira or Porto Santo. The team was careful not to overstate the result. A similarity was not proof, and without an exact mapping of symbols to letters or words, the interpretation remained speculative. Still, it hinted that technology might eventually narrow the possibilities, even if it couldn't produce a definitive translation. The nature of the unfinished ledger, K, in its stubborn opacity, has come to represent something beyond its own content. Some is a reminder that history is full of unfinished stories, that not all questions are meant to be answered in a single lifetime. To others, it's a challenge, a provocation from the past, daring the present to try harder. The archivists still turn its pages under soft light. The smell of leather still rises faintly when it is opened. Symbols still look as strange now as they did the first day they were written. The codes have resisted war, neglect, mildew, and the passing of centuries. They have outlasted empires, and perhaps they will outlast the current generation of readers too, because breaking a code is not always about intelligence alone. Sometimes it depends on finding that one missing link. The companion document lying forgotten in another archive. The casual, marginal note that explains everything. If such a link exists, it may be resting in some other collection, mislabeled and overlooked. It may be on the shelf of a small town library, tucked into the back of a drawer in a coastal monastery, or even hidden among the personal papers of a family who never knew they were holding the key. The ledger waits, and the question remains, if the meaning were finally unlocked, would it simply confirm what we already suspect? Or would it redraw part of the map of the world? The divers first saw it as a shadow, in the dim green water, lit only by their helmet lamps. The outline seemed no different from the dozens of other shapes scattered across the seabed, broken timbers, collapsed beams, ribs of a hull now only half embedded in the silt. But as they moved closer, fanning away the fine layer of sand that had settled over it, they realized this was not simply another decayed frame of the ship. It was a barrel, not the open kind, whose staves had long since rotted into driftwood, but a whole one, intact, its curved body still bound by rusted but solid iron hoops. The wood was blackened by centuries underwater, yet it held together. A testament to the craftsmanship of coopers who built for voyages measured in months, not years. The year was 1994, and the wreck they were surveying was believed to be one of the last voyages of a late 15th century merchant vessel. The ship had been lying off the coast for nearly 500 years. Many of its contents had been scattered, eaten away, or buried beyond reach. But this barrel had survived, sealed tight against time, and tied an object out of place from the moment they saw it. The divers knew it was unusual. Most barrels from shipwrecks of this period are found open or split, their contents long dispersed. This one, however, had its top still wedged in place with a seal of pitch that had hardened into something like stone. The metal bands were corroded, but unbroken. Even the seams between staves were tightly compressed, suggesting that whatever was inside had not swollen or shrunk enough to break the seal. Underwater archaeology is slow work. The barrel could not simply be yanked up to the surface. The pressure change alone might destroy it, so the team began the methodical process of stabilizing its surroundings, gently excavating the sand and debris that had partly buried it. They recorded its position from multiple angles, measuring its distance from the collapsed midship bulkhead and from what they believed to be the remains of the ship's May and Maze T. There were debates, even then, down among the divers. Some argued that they should open it underwater to see if anything inside was worth the trouble. Others insisted that moving it whole would preserve more information, not just the contents, but the residue of the interior, the condition of the seal, and even traces of the water that might have seeped in over centuries. In the end, they chose patience. The lift to the surface took 3 days to prepare for the barrel's lift. First, a special netting cradle was wrapped around it. distributing the strain evenly so that no single stave would crack under its own weight. Then, small inflatable lift bags were attached, inflating them in stages. The barrel could be coaxed upward without sudden stress. When it broke the surface for the first time since the late 1400s, the scene was oddly anticlimactic. The water drained away in slow rivulets. The wood glistened black in the daylight, and the smell, a faint, almost sweet odor of old resin and deep-sea minerals, drifted across the deck of the support boat. Was, at first glance, just a large, ancient barrel, but to the archaeologists, its intactness was everything. The seal of pitch had hardened into a near-permeable crust, mottled with barnacle scars. No one knew if there was air inside, liquid, or a dense packed cargo. No one knew if the contents were still recognizable after centuries. Why it mattered sealed. Containers from this era are rare because of the realities of ocean travel and shipwreck decay. Most cargo holds were packed with goods in barrels, chests, and sacks. Once a ship broke apart, those containers spilled open, floated away, or shattered under the battering of waves. Even if a barrel remained in place, changes in water pressure and temperature, combined with bacterial action, could eventually split the wood. An intact barrel meant one thing above all: a snapshot. Its contents would be whatever had been loaded. In the late 15th century, unspoiled by later contamination, unshuffled by scavengers, whether it held food, drink, trade goods, or something rarer. It could provide a direct link to the cargo practices, provisioning standards, and trade routes of its time. For maritime historians, this was not just about the object itself, but about the patterns it might reveal. Did the ship carry standard merchant cargo, or was it transporting something unusual for its route? Was it provisioning a distant outpost, or carrying goods for exchange in a port further afield? A single sealed container could answer questions that dozens of scattered fragments could not. The decision not to open yet once brought ashore. The barrel was transferred to a maritime conservation lab. There, specialists faced a choice: open it immediately, while it was still saturated from its time underwater, or begin the long process of controlled desalination and drying, risking that whatever was inside might change in the meantime. The decision was made to wait. Opening it too soon could lead to collapse of the wood, contamination of organic materials, or chemical reactions in metals or minerals inside. Instead, the barrel was placed in a large tank of filtered water. Over weeks and months, the water would be changed and monitored to slowly draw out the salt that had soaked into the wood. During this time, small endoscopic probes were considered, but the pitch seal was so hard and the wood so compressed that inserting a scope risked breaking the top. The barrel remained closed, frustrating to those eager for answers, but reassuring to those who knew the dangers of haste. Speculations and theories while the conservation process continued. Speculation began. Some pointed to the ship's likely origin as a Portuguese merchant vessel and suggested the barrel could contain vinho verde, or fortified wine, shipped to outposts or to markets further south. Others thought it might be olive oil, a commodity that traveled well in sealed containers and was a common part of maritime trade. A more intriguing theory, however, came from a historian of Atlantic exploration. He noted that the ship's route, based on wreck location and prevailing currents, suggested it might have been part of an early provisioning mission to a far-off archipelago or to trading posts along the African coast. In such cases, barrels were sometimes used to transport precious trade goods, beads, copper, rods, or even silver coinage, all packed tightly in sawdust or cloth to prevent shifting. If that were the case, then the barrel might not be food or drink at all, but something meant for barter. And if the goods inside were of unusual type or origin, they might hint at a more ambitious voyage, perhaps even toward lands not officially recorded in the surviving documents, a reminder from the past in the lab. The barrel sat in its tank, under gentle lighting, watched by sensors. Visitors could only see it through a glass panel, a black curve of wood held steady in its cradled netting. To those unfamiliar with shipwreck archaeology, it looked like very little, just an old, wet cylinder. But for those who understood, it was an almost impossible survivor from a violent sinking. Some imagined the moment it was loaded, the cooper lowering it into the hold, the merchant checking the pitch seal, the sailors sliding it into place against the bulkhead, perhaps marking its location in a ledger now long lost. In that moment, the barrel was just one of many, an anonymous part of a cargo plan. It could have been placed beside crates of dried fish, casks of wine, or bundles of wool. No one on board would have thought it was remarkable. 5 centuries later, it was the only one left. A question left hanging months passed, and the conservation continued. The salt content of the wood slowly dropped. The researchers ran X-rays, but the dense mass inside, whatever it was, made for an indistinct blur. There were no obvious metal shapes, no clear outlines. The mystery deepened. It could be grain, it could be stone beads, it could be compressed fiber. The tests could not say . At conferences, the team presented careful updates. They avoided sensational language, but the barrel always drew attention. It's a combination of its perfect seal and the unknown interior was irresistible to human curiosity. And yet, as of that first year in the lab, no one had dared to break the seal. The pitch top remained untouched. The hoops still clung to the wood. The contents were still hidden. If they opened it, they might find something world-changing, or nothing more than a sludged, unidentifiable mess. If they didn't open it, they might preserve the chance, however slim, that new technology in the future could reveal everything without harm. So the question hung in the air. Should the past be unsealed now, or should it be allowed to keep its secret for a little longer? By the spring of the following year, the barrel had become a fixture in the conservation lab, as much a part of the place as the scent of treated oak and the constant, almost imperceptible hum of the climate control system. It sat in its dedicated tank of deionized water, the cradle holding it steady, the pitch top facing slightly upward so that any tiny changes could be easily inspected. The researchers had developed a rhythm around it. Every Monday, the water was tested for changes in salinity and microbial activity. Every Thursday, a technician would brush away the faint algae film that wanted to grow on the outside, though the low light in the room discouraged it. Every Friday, they would gather for a brief update, where the week's readings were compared with a long-term conservation plan. And every Friday, without fail, someone would quietly suggest, maybe it's time to open it. The arguments for opening. The strongest argument for opening the barrel was obvious: human curiosity. This was not just a container. It was a sealed message from the 15th century, sent without the sender knowing who would receive it. For the archaeologists, opening it meant answering questions that had been building for months. For the historians, it meant potentially rewriting parts of trade history. There were practical reasons, too. Even in the most careful conservation, waterlogged with changes over time. Bacteria can awaken in micropockets inside the barrel. Those bacteria were feeding on organic matter, grain, dried fruit, wood shavings. The delay could mean losing whatever identification was possible. Waiting too long could allow the contents to degrade into a uniform, unrecognizable mush. And then there was funding. The excavation project had been costly, and its backers wanted tangible results. A sealed barrel was intriguing, but a sealed barrel with a definitive, photogenic discovery inside was the kind of thing that could earn museum displays, documentaries, and new grants. The arguments for waiting, but the other side argued with equal passion. Opening the barrel, they said, was irreversible. Once the seal was broken, the delicate environment inside would be exposed to modern air, microbes, and temperature changes. If the contents were organic, they might decay rapidly. If they were metallic, they could corrode within hours once oxygen reached them. There were also unknowns about the pitch seal. It had been exposed to centuries of salt water and might contain minerals that could react with air in unpredictable ways. Breaking it hastily might even damage the wood around it, causing the staves to split and making the entire object unstable. And then there was a subtler argument, one of principle. Archaeology, some said, was not about satisfying immediate curiosity. It was about preservation for the long arc of human knowledge. The tools of 1995 were better than those of 1975, but the tools of 2025 or 2050 would be better still. By waiting, future archaeologists could benefit from advances in scanning, molecular analysis, and non-invasive imaging. A compromise plant the stalemate continued until one Friday meeting when a quiet-spoken conservator proposed something in between. They would prepare for opening as if it were imminent, but they would not actually break the seal until certain benchmarks were met. The first benchmark would be stabilization of the wood to a specific moisture content. The second would be the complete mapping of the barrel structure with new, high-resolution CT scans being developed in collaboration with a local medical imaging facility. Okay? And the third would be the creation of a sealed, oxygen-free chamber in which the barrel could be opened, ensuring that whatever was inside would not be exposed to normal atmospheric conditions. It was a plan that appealed to both sides, cautious enough to protect the artifact, but decisive enough to keep the process moving forward. The imaging session, the CT scanning day, came 6 weeks later. The barrel, still in its cradle, was carefully lifted from its tank, wrapped in damp cloth to prevent surface drying, and transported in a climate-controlled truck to the imaging center. There, it was loaded into the machine, a large ring that could rotate around the object while sending thin slices of X-ray data to a computer. The results were complicated. The images showed dense masses inside, but without clear shapes. There were no coins stacked neatly in rows, no obvious amphora fragments, no clear outlines of metal objects. Instead, there seemed to be irregular lumps, all roughly the same density, scattered loosely toward the lower half of the barrel. The upper portion appeared to be filled with some softer material, possibly organic, possibly decomposed packing. One technician suggested it looked like dried legumes or seeds. Another thought it might be lumps of resin. A third, who had studied trade goods from similar wrecks, wondered aloud if it might be ambergris, the rare and valuable substance from sperm whales that was occasionally transported in barrels. The scan had not solved the mystery. If anything, it had deepened it. The opening chamber, meanwhile, in the conservation lab, work began on the special chamber. It was a large, transparent enclosure, fitted with glove ports, similar to those used in high-containment science labs. The air inside could be replaced with inert nitrogen gas, preventing oxidation. Temperature and humidity could be precisely controlled. A bank of cameras and lights would record the process from multiple angles, creating a permanent archive. The chamber was not cheap. It was funded partly by the project budget and partly by a donation from a historical foundation whose director was particularly interested in maritime trade. The foundation's only request was that, once opened, the contents be displayed to the public in an exhibit titled The Last Barrel, the day before, by the end of that summer. The moisture content of the wood had reached a target. The CT scans had been archived. The chamber was ready. A date was set. The barrel would be opened the following Tuesday. On Monday afternoon, the lab was unusually quiet. The technicians moved slowly, as if in respect. The project's lead archaeologist, a man with 30 years of shipwreck experience, stood by the tank for a long time, his hand resting lightly on the cradle. He later admitted that part of him didn't want to know what was inside. Spin the perfect mystery, he said. Once we open it, we can't put the mystery back. That night, the lab security system logged 3 separate visits from staff who had no reason to be there. They didn't touch the barrel. They just stood near it, looking. It was, in its own quiet way, a moment of farewell. The seal breaks Tuesday morning. The barrel was lifted, still in its cradle, into the chamber. The nitrogen purge began, flushing the air inside until oxygen levels dropped to near zero. The conservators donned gloves and face shields. The camera clicked into steady recording mode. The first step was to scrape away the barnacle scars and mineral accretions around the pitch seal. This was done with small dental tools, flake by flake, revealing the original dark, glossy surface of the pitch. Then, with a narrow chisel, they began to chip at the center seam. The pitch was harder than expected. It cracked not in shards, but in slow, sticky fragments, each one giving off a faint, sharp scent, not unpleasant, but alien-like, something between pine, resin, and old leather. The smell was intensified by the enclosed chamber. When the last wedge of pitch was pried free, the wooden plug beneath was revealed, a disc of oak, fitted tightly into the barrel's opening. It was swollen from centuries of saturation, and it took careful levering to lift it without splintering. And then, with a muffled pop, more of a sigh, really, the seal broke. What they saw, the first thing to emerge, was not an object, but a smell. Not rot, not salt, but something sweet and faintly spicy, as if dried centuries-old herbs had been disturbed. It was subtle enough that it might have been imagined, yet everyone in the chamber noticed it. Inside, under the gentle light, were lumps the size of fists, irregular and pale brown. Some were cracked, revealing a fibrous interior. Between them was a loose, dry material, crumbs, dust, perhaps the remnants of something that had once filled the gaps. One conservator reached in with a gloved hand and lifted a lump. It was light, almost weightless. A small flake came away under her fingers. She placed it in a sample vial for later analysis. The lumps were piled toward the bottom, just as the scans had shown. Above them, pressed against the inside of the barrel, was a residue that looked like it might have been cloth, perhaps. Sacking used to keep the lumps from shifting during the voyage. There were no obvious markings, no stamped symbols, no tags to explain their origin. The unanswered question chemical analysis would take weeks. But one thing was immediately clear. This was not wine, not grain, not coins. The lumps did not dissolve in water. They did not crumble like dried fruit. They were oddly uniform in texture, yet irregular in shape. One historian on the team, after peering into the barrel for a long time, quietly said, "If this is what I think it is, then it's not supposed to be here." But he didn't explain. Further, not yet. The cameras kept recording. The gloves kept moving the lumps into trays. The rest of the barrel was photographed, sampled, and documented. The seal, once broken, could not be restored. The mystery had changed shape, but it had not gone away. Whatever the lumps were, quote, their presence in this barrel on this ship would raise more questions than it answered. And in that sense, the barrel had done what all the best mysteries do. It had refused to give up all its secrets. When the lid was set aside and the last of the pale brown lumps was transferred into trays, the room seemed to exhale. The months of speculation, the cautious preparations, the weeks of holding back the impulse to know all of it had given way to a new kind of waiting. Now, it was no longer about what was in the barrel, but about what the laboratory instruments would decide those things really were. The lead conservator sealed the trays, inside in Nurcast containers. They would be handled as little as possible before analysis. What samples from the inner staves were also taken, their grain pattern and residue carefully mapped so nothing of context would be lost. Even the faint threads of cloth pressed into the barrel wall were coaxed free intact. slid into acid-free envelopes, and labeled in tiny, neat handwriting. No one made a big announcement. There was no theatrical flourish, no press release. The team knew from experience that the real work happened away from cameras, in the slow, patient glow of microscopes and the soft hiss of spectrometers. The first analysis, the first results, came back from the mass spectrometer late on a Friday evening, almost exactly a week after the opening. The technician who ran the machine sent a brief, almost cryptic note: organic, plant-derived, presence of complex terpenoids. You'll want to see this. Terpenoids were a chemical class often found in aromatic substances, things like resins, essential oils, certain spices, and even some medicinal plants. Their presence immediately ruled out mundane cargo like dried beans or preserved meat. Instead, it suggested something more deliberate, more valuable, and possibly more exotic. The laboratory's chemist, a woman with decades of experience analyzing archaeological residues, sat at her desk late into the night, comparing the results to known samples in the global database. Several matches appeared: frankincense, myrrh, pine, resin, copal, but none were perfect. The ratios of the compounds were unusual, leaning toward a profile not common in European or Mediterranean trade goods of the era. By Saturday morning, the working theory was that the lumps might be a resin from a tropical tree, possibly imported from Africa, Arabia, or even farther afield. That, in itself, was remarkable for a shipwreck believed to have been part of an early 15th century European coastal trading fleet. The historians step in. When the chemist presented her findings to the historians on Monday, the reaction was a mix of excitement and skepticism. If the resin really was from such a distant source, it meant that the ship's voyage, or at least its cargo's journey, was part of a much larger network of trade than previously documented. One maritime historian pointed out that, in the decades before Columbus, European seafaring was not as insular as some imagined. Goods from the Indian Ocean world had been reaching Mediterranean ports for centuries via overland routes and occasional maritime links. Still, the idea that a northern European vessel might carry such a resin suggested either unusual access or unusual purpose. Another historian asked the obvious question: why the secrecy? If this resin was valuable, why not store it in amphorae or marked containers like other high-value goods? Why hide it in an unmarked barrel with a seal so tight it had survived the sea floor? The cloth tells a story. The cloth fragments proved just as interesting. Under the microscope, their weave was dense but irregular, with a pattern of spun fibers that did not match European linen or wool. Kypra analysis identified them as bast fibers from a plant species not native to Europe. The closest matches were two textiles produced in parts of West Africa and along the Red Sea coast. That link deepened the mystery. If the resin was indeed tropical and the cloth was from Africa, then the barrel represented a cargo connection that skirted the edge of known maritime history for the region, suggested a possible African-European exchange that had either gone unrecorded or been intentionally minimized in surviving documents. Ambergris revisited week later. A different lab returned a surprising secondary result. Alongside the plant terpenoids, there were traces of compounds more often associated with ambergris, the rare and highly prized substance formed in the digestive tracts of sperm whales. Ambergris was valued in Europe, both as a fixative for perfumes and as a luxury item in its own right. Its scent, earthy and marine, yet strangely pleasant, matched some of what the conservators had reported smelling when the seal first broke. This was strange. The resin profile didn't match pure ambergris, but the chemical markers suggested that at least some of the lumps might be mixtures, resin blended with ambergris, possibly as a composite trade good. That practice had precedent in certain Indian Ocean markets, where resinous materials were combined with ambergris to extend their volume or modify their scent. The blending of such substances could mean cargo was not raw material at all, but a prepared product, perhaps a form of incense or perfume baits intended for elite consumers. Reconsidering the ship, the more they learned about the barrel, the harder it became to fit the ship into a neat category. The cargo had indeed originated partly from African or Arabian sources. It was not simply a coastal trader. Its owners must have had access to merchants who could bridge vast distances, moving goods along a chain of exchanges stretching from the tropics to the cold North Atlantic. It also hinted at political or diplomatic dimensions. In the 15th century, certain goods were controlled not only by market forces, but by rulers who saw them as symbols of prestige. Carrying such cargo without proper authorization could have been risky, perhaps even illicit. That might explain why it was packed in an unmarked barrel and sealed so tightly. If intercepted, it would be harder for rivals or inspectors to identify or claim. The question of timing dating the barrels would confirm that it had been constructed only a few years before the ship sank. That meant the cargo was fresh, not an old stockpile being transported for resale. The short lifespan between tree felling, barrel making, and sealing suggested urgency. The goods were valuable enough to move quickly once obtained. This detail, paired with the ship's known sinking date, placed the voyage within a narrow window of geopolitical change. Portuguese exploration down the West African coast was beginning to intensify, and the old Mediterranean-controlled trade routes were being challenged. It was a time when new connections were opening, but not yet widely known, a fertile ground for quiet, high-profit exchanges. Theories multiplied by late autumn. The academic papers had begun. One argued that the barrel's contents were evidence of a shadow network of trade running parallel to the officially recorded routes, a network that connected European ports with African and Arabian goods through intermediaries, perhaps via North African traders operating outside the reach of the main monopolies. Another paper took a different angle. Perhaps the barrel represented an early attempt to import luxury goods for elite European households, bypassing traditional supply chains to secure exclusivity. The fact that the ship sank before delivery might explain why no record of such goods reached the historical record. A more cautious voice suggested that the cargo might have been part of a diplomatic gift, resin and ambergris being prized, not only for their material value, but for their symbolic association with distant, powerful realms. Such a gift, if intended for a court, might have been kept discreet until the moment of presentation. What was lost? What was gained in the end? The barrel did not give a single, clear answer. It offered instead a set of possibilities, each one opening into a different version of the past. Perhaps it was evidence of an African-European connection that modern historians had underestimated. Perhaps it was a piece of maritime smuggling, hidden in plain sight. Perhaps it was nothing more than a private merchant's gamble on an unusual product. What it certainly was, however, was a reminder that even a single object can hold an entire chain of human effort, from the tapping of resin in a tropical forest, to the crafting of cloth far from European shores, to the sealing of a barrel in a dockside warehouse, to its resting place under cold seawater for centuries. Back to the sea once, the analyses were complete and the necessary samples preserved. The remaining lumps were stabilized for long-term storage. Some went to the National Maritime Museum, others to the local historical society. The empty barrel, carefully dried and treated, went on display in a dim, climate-controlled case. Visitors could see the dark sheen of the pitch, the faint scrape marks from the opening, the hand-forged iron hoops. Beside it, simple placard read, recovered from the wreck of an early 15th century ship. Cane cant, plant resin mixed with ambergris, origin unknown. Theories of trade, diplomacy, and secrecy remain under study. The phrasing was deliberate. It made no claims it couldn't prove. It left the mystery alive, just enough to make people pause before moving on. The barrel's legacy, years later. The research papers spawned a small but persistent shift in the study of pre-Columbian maritime trade. The barrel became a case study in university courses, a quiet reminder that history's edges are rarely neat. It also inspired further searches, not for barrels specifically, but for overlooked clues in shipwrecks where mundane cargo might hide extraordinary stories.
The conservators sometimes joked that the barrel had been a better ambassador for their discipline than any lecture could have been. It showed that patience, method, and restraint could yield discoveries without spectacle, and that some of the best finds were those that kept at least part of their secret. And so the barrel, once unseen on the ocean floor, then untouched in a lab for months, entered history not as a solved puzzle, but as an open question, preserved for anyone willing to follow its scent through time. Asterisk, when the divers first recovered it, the object didn't look like much, just a warped rectangle of wood and leather, swollen from centuries under salt water. Its edges were fringed with the remnants of some kind of binding. The whole thing was so encrusted with barnacle growth and mineral deposits that at first glance it was catalogued as possible carpentry scrap. Only later, during a second pass through the ship's stern debris field, did one of the archaeologists notice the faint suggestion of a seam along one side, the kind of seam where parchment or paper might once have been sewn in. That changed everything. Scrap wood didn't need binding. A bound object, even a small one, implied intention. It was lifted gently into a padded crate and sent with the rest of the ship's surviving timbers to the conservation lab. The long drying paper and parchment from a shipwreck are the most delicate of all finds. Unlike pottery or metal, which can be stabilized with chemical baths, organic writing materials collapse into mush if they dry too quickly. The conservators used a slow desalination bath, replacing the water in microscopic increments, then moved the object into a freeze dryer, a process that could take months. No one expected much. Centuries of immersion usually erased ink entirely. At best, they hoped for blank parchment that could be analyzed for its animal source. At worst, they would get nothing more than a fragile, anonymous stack of softened fibers. But when the freeze-dryer cycle ended and the object was finally unwrapped, the lab fell into an odd, focused silence. The outer layer of mineral deposits had flaked away to reveal a dark, cracked cover of leather. It had once been dyed deep brown, maybe even black, and stamped faintly with a border of small diamond shapes. This was no makeshift account book. It was something made with skill, meant to last. The first page, the spine, had given way, so the conservators could ease the gatherings of pages apart one by one. Each was brittle, translucent in patches, smelling faintly of salt and age. But against all expectation, traces of writing remained. Not ink in the modern sense. The seawater had carried away anything that could dissolve. Instead, what remained were ghostly impressions in the fibers themselves, where the pressure of a quill had deformed the surface just enough to survive. In some places, where iron gall ink had once bitten slightly into the skin of the parchment, faint shadows of letters still lingered. The writing was neat, compact, and in a hand that suggested training, the angled strokes and even spacing of a professional scribe. But it was not in Latin, nor was it in any of the Romance or Germanic languages. The historians on hand could immediately recognize a script out of place within hours. Photographs of the pages were being shared with paleographers around Europe. The consensus once the initial disbelief passed, was that the script bore the strongest resemblance to a late medieval adaptation of Arabic script, not the flowing, decorative calligraphy of Quranic manuscripts, but the practical, abbreviated, hand used for merchant records and correspondence. That alone was startling. Ships from the North Atlantic trading world did not usually carry ledgers written in Arabic script, especially not ones that appeared to be freshly compiled at the time of sinking. A maritime historian who had spent years working on Iberian coastal archives noted that in the decades before Columbus, Arabic-speaking merchants, many from North Africa, maintained an active presence in certain southern European ports. Some even acted as intermediaries in long-distance trade. But for a ledger in Arabic script to be found on a ship believed to have sunk far from those ports suggested either a very unusual voyage or an unusual crew composition. The missing names, if the script was the first surprise, the second was what? It didn't contain page after page of the ledger recorded dates, locations, quantities of goods, and descriptions, but almost never the names of buyers or sellers where a name should appear. There was instead a mark, a small symbol, different, on almost every line. Some were geometric, others looked like stylized animals or plants, and a few were little more than cryptic squiggles. The effect was unsettling, as though the ledger had been deliberately anonymized. One historian proposed that the marks might be merchant seals, rendered in shorthand, a way to indicate a party without writing their name, useful in case the ledger fell into the wrong hands. Another argued that the ledger might not be a record for day-to-day trade at all, but part of a more secretive accounting, perhaps, for a network that deliberately kept its membership obscure. The ledger's geographied, despite the lack of names. The ledger gave clues to its own geography, the place names, written phonetically in the Arabic script, suggested a range that spanned from ports in the Mediterranean to locations along the Atlantic coasts of Iberia and France. A few entries even appeared to reference ports in the British Isles, although the transliteration made them difficult to confirm. If accurate, this meant that the ledger's owner, whoever they were, had a network that reached across several maritime worlds, each with its own language, currency, and set of rules. In the pre-Columbian Atlantic, such a network would have been rare and valuable. It also made the ship's cargo, including the mysterious resin barrel, make more sense. Perhaps this vessel had been a link in a chain that connected markets, which official records treated as entirely separate. The question of ownership, who would have kept such a ledger? One theory pointed to North African merchant families, some of whom maintained partnerships with European traders well into the 15th century, despite political tensions. Another pointed to a hybrid identity, perhaps a Christian merchant, trained in Arabic script to better handle trade with Muslim partners, or vice versa. There was also the possibility of espionage. Ledgers like this could serve as intelligence documents, tracking the flow of goods, routes, and seasonal patterns for purposes beyond simple profit. In a century where maritime power was shifting rapidly, such information would have been priceless. The material Cluster ledger's parchment came from goatskin, confirmed by microscopic hair follicle patterns that matched production centers in the Mediterranean rather than northern Europe. The leather of the cover, however, came from cattle hide, and its tanning chemicals suggested a northern process. This combination hinted that the book had been assembled from components sourced in different regions, perhaps even made to order by someone who traveled widely. The ink residue, what little could be detected, contained traces of gum, Arabic, a common binding agent in medieval inks, but one imported into Europe primarily through African and Middle Eastern trade. Even the thread used to bind the gatherings told a story. It was made from flax, but spun in a tight S-twist style, more common in North Africa than in Europe. A ledger. Without an ending, the final pages of the ledger were blank. Not torn out, not damaged, just empty. It was as though the record keeper had stopped mid-project. The last dated entry fell only weeks before the estimated date of the ship's sinking. That raised another question. Was the ledger meant to be delivered to someone else? If so, then it was in transit when the ship went down. Whoever was expecting it never received it, and the information it contained about trade flows, about anonymous participants, about the geography of a shadow network, was lost to its intended recipient. The silence after, if any historical records exist of the ship's loss, they have not been found. No surviving archive contains a complaint about missing cargo that matches the resin or the ledger's contents. That silence is telling. Either the voyage was unrecorded because it was unofficial, or those involved had reason to keep the loss quiet. The ledger, recovered centuries later, became the only surviving witness to that vanished network. It does not give up its names. It does not reveal its owner. But in the careful strokes of its script, in the ordered columns of quantities and symbols, it holds the outline of a trade that official history forgot or ignored. If you want, I can move next into Story 5, Section 2, where we follow the ledger's journey through modern analysis. How cryptographers tried to decode the symbols, and how one unexpected link to a distant port changed the entire interpretation. That section will also run 1,500 plus words and keep the same quiet, immersive style.